You are our guest tonight, and you're talking history. Minneapolis, in Minnesota, Tom wrote a book about how you're changing day by day. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, it's that time again. This is the last time for a while, but hey, coming to you live right now from a very, very empty and very, very clean and disinfected Bryant Lake Bowl. Please welcome your host for a special edition of the Theater of Public Policy. It's Tane Danger.
Hey, everybody. Oh, that is delightful. Thank you so much, Dennis Curley. Oh, what an opening. Hey, everyone. My name is Tane Danger. I am here at the Bryant Lake Bowl for our final show, the Theater of Public Policy of our spring season. So a couple of things to say up at the top. Thank you very much for being here. Yes, this is our usual home, the Bryant Lake Bowl Theater, which we love as an institution. And when this whole pandemic thing started and we had to shelter in place, we were so sad because we weren't able to bring people into this theater space where we normally do our shows and talk to amazing guests. But thanks to a very nice letter from the actual state of Minnesota, they said that I could show up here at the Bryant Lake Bowl as long as I was by myself, with the exception of our fabulous technician, Brian, who is 6 feet away from me at all times, and live broadcast from here so that you at home could see the Bryant Lake Bowl and that it is still here and that it needs your support. Good news, Bryant Lake Bowl started doing weekend brunch service, and so you can do curbside pickup of weekend brunch from the Bryant Lake Bowl this weekend if you wanted, and you should, because it helps support them. It makes sure that this amazing theater, restaurant, and bowling alley sticks around for years to come. So thank you so much to the Bryant Lake Bowl for having us here. I am so excited for tonight's show. It's going to be fantastic. We have a really terrific guest who I've admired for a long time. I couldn't be more excited for this topic, the history of Minneapolis, that we're going to talk about on tonight's show. Before we do, I do have to do a couple other very quick thank yous. One, to our beer sponsor, I'm going to get it right. Our beer sponsor all season long, Finnegans Beer, amazing Finnegans Beer, who all year, even though, again, we've all been sort of paralyzed in some ways by this pandemic, they are still making and delivering and serving great beer. And when you go to the Finnegans Tap Room Brewery in downtown Minneapolis, if you mention T2P2 when you go, you can get 10% off tomorrow on your curbside pickup of Finnegans Beer. My favorite thing about Finnegans Beer, honestly, other than that it is delicious, is that every dollar that they get, they go and they donate back. Every dollar of profit that they make, they donate all their profits to local food shelves and feeding the hungry. So by going and getting some Finnegans Beer, you are supporting a local brewery, you're getting delicious beer, and you're helping feed the hungry. So it's all very good, and you should do these things. Thank you as well to our media sponsor all season, MinPost, who's been helping get the word out about all of our shows. Last announcement I'm going to make, because I'm going to introduce these folks in just a second. This is our last show of the season, but we do have a lot of amazing things that we are planning to do all season, summer long, and that we hope that you'll come and join us for some of those. And I'll say more about those in a second. For now, I actually want to introduce the cast of the Theater of Public Policy. So every show, what do? We talk to a smart person on stage, and then this team of amazing, talented, beautiful people come and they bring it all to life. They're entirely unscripted improv comedy theater. Can we, wherever you are, make a big round of applause for the cast of the Theater of Public Policy, who tonight are
Duck Washington,
Jim Robinson,
Chris Rodriguez,
Aaron Roberts,
Dennis Curley. Hello.
Hey, Dennis. Oh, that's fantastic. And wait, just sit there for 1 second, because this is the other thing that I was going to say, is that if you can't get through an entire week without us, which I'm sure that there are dozens of you. Next week, you can take a very cool workshop that we're doing, a virtual workshop with Jim and Aaron here, who are going to do a workshop called The Art of Online Communication. It's something that we are all having to deal with and figure out. And they have distilled it into a fabulous 1-hour workshop that you can sign up for. I think there's probably already a link in our chat that you can find. So go and spend some time with Jim and Aaron. It'll be fun. You'll learn skills. It'll be great. All right. That's good. Thank you, guys. We'll see you all in a little bit. All right. Okay. So now what do? Now we are going to welcome our fabulous guest onto the stage for this fabulous conversation. I am really excited for this. A lot of people know him, a longtime journalist here in the Twin Cities, Minnesota region. He has written other books before, but this book in particular, I'm so excited about. He's the author of the very, very shortly forthcoming Minneapolis, an Urban Biography. And that is what we are going to talk to him tonight all about. Please, wherever you are, a big round of applause as we welcome to the virtual stage, Mr. Tom Weber. Wow.
Hello. Thank you to Dennis for the only song that's ever been written about me hitherto. Yes.
Hitherto. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here. And congratulations on the book. So just to set the table. So the book, Minneapolis, an Urban Biography, right? Is that how it comes?
No, this is an early draft that I had to edit, and we're cutting it so close with the release that I don't actually have the full printed version yet, but it's coming, and we should have it in bookstores the first week of June. Fingers crossed. But you can pre-order now. If you pre-order it, it doesn't matter when it comes out because they'll just send it to you. So get to your local bookstore, get to your Minnesota Historical Society Press, wherever you want to pre-order it, do it now, and then just sit back, and whenever it shows up, it'll be a lovely surprise in the mail.
So Minneapolis, an Urban Biography, and this is exciting, I'll say, because surprisingly, there aren't a ton of histories of the city of Minneapolis. So let me ask you this, where you're trying to write the story of an entire city, where do you start?
Well, you start fortunately, I'm doing the book with the Minnesota Historical Society, right? So like if you're gonna go anywhere, that's a good place to start. They've got all the books. They actually gave me a bunch, this is just a small sampling of the kind of things they gave me. You go online, there's a lot of great online resources, and then you just park it in a local library, or you go to there's a great room at the central downtown library in Minneapolis for when it reopens called the Minneapolis Room or the Minneapolis Collection.
Yeah.
And it's where you can find really old, it's like the Library of Congress where like they'll go but get it for you kind of things, and like these old materials and old books and things like that. And that Minneapolis Collection book has one of the few copies of the book that I've ever been able to find that I could actually hold and read, of the book that Amy Klobuchar read when she was a law student about the building of the Metrodome. And it's actually pretty well written. And so,
Can I just say, so this is
throwing that out there.
This is a book. Amy Klobuchar didn't write this book. She just read it. She did write it.
It was actually like, I believe it was like a law school, essay, or it was like a final exam, and the professors liked it so much, this is my understanding of the story, that they said you should actually get this printed. And she did. And so it tells the painstaking details of what was more than a decade of back and forth, and who's going to pay for it, and legislation, and blah blah blah, and funding and public funding. More than a decade. She tells the whole story, but there aren't a ton of copies. So you have to go to a place like the Minneapolis Collection at the downtown library to grab it, but you can't check it out. You have to read it there.
Okay, so you started with the pile of books in at the library.
That's right.
And then storytelling wise, where do you start? Because I imagine you could start with the geography. You could start with the people. You could start with, I don't know, a whole variety of different ways to approach this. So where's your entry point into Minneapolis as a city?
Well, it has to be about the people, right, of the city. That's the thing you say in an interview like this, but it really is true. Like you have to say it has to be about the people. But the other thing you have to note with Minneapolis is that the only reason Minneapolis exists where it does and for the reasons it does is because of the falls. What became known as St. Anthony Falls, it's the only waterfall on the entire length of the Mississippi River. And the force of those falls, the water power of those falls, allowed mills to be built for the timber industry and the grain industry, which allowed these huge industries like Pillsbury, for example, and what became General Mills to grow up. If you don't have the falls at that spot, there's very little reason to build a city there, or at the time, a settlement. Now, this is talking about when the white people came in to colonize everything. You then have to go back to the time when Native Americans and indigenous people were here. Same story. The falls to the Dakota people were a very sacred place. And so just south of the falls, which is where the Mississippi and the Minnesota River converge, today it's known as the place where Fort Snelling stands, but it's also the place called Bedote, which is a place of creation. It is I can't really say how sacred, I mean, it is so sacred to the Dakota people. So you start with those geographies. You start with Bedote, which is the reason, the Dakota people are here and stayed here. And then you go up to the falls and say, when it came time to colonize, there was no reason to build a Minneapolis if you didn't have those falls.
Okay, so the falls and the convergence of these rivers is for generations and generations before Europeans came here were important. And then it becomes sort of an impetus for building a city for the Europeans largely who came here. So, okay, so I would guess we say, okay, so yes, we want to build a city here. And yet there are other places that are built along the river. And there's other places that are built even not along Mississippi Falls, because as you pointed out, there aren't very many of those yet.
Right.
Minneapolis grew in a way that was different than a lot of other cities. So I guess why did it sort of take off from there?
So for one thing, you got to read a huge book called North Country, which tells the making of Minnesota, about everything that happened before Minnesota was a state. And one of the things you learn is that the woods were so thick here, especially in northern Minnesota and around here. This place, before white people showed up, was so thick with vegetation and nature, and it was hard to get to. It was a hard place for explorers, as they called themselves, to even get through. And so there's this huge delay and there's other parts of what became the United States that are popping up because they're just kind of the next place over on the map to send settlers and settler colonists into. The terrain up here was so unforgiving that there's this long spell when there really wasn't a lot going on.
Right.
For among the Europeans, I'm talking about the indigenous.
You had native tribes who were here, and then you had some French fur traders, and the occasional priest who did bad things, probably. Yeah,
and then it just starts. So the thing I learned about the book the thing I learned about Minneapolis, I should say, that I never knew was that the falls I just mentioned have not always been where they are. And in fact, 10,000 years ago, those falls were over in what became St. Paul, and they were as big as Niagara Falls. I'm no joke. Like geologically speaking, these falls that I just touted Minneapolis for started in St. Paul. So someone needs to make a shirt about that. And if you think about it, St. Paul started first, and when we talk about in the era of colonization and the white people living here, St. Paul started first because as you come up the Mississippi River, St. Paul is the last point on the river that is relatively easy, very relative because it was still hard to get to. Once you go past St. Paul heading up the river to Minneapolis. It is so hard to navigate in those 18th century boats and those 19th century boats. Nobody wanted to do it. So St. Paul became known as the head of navigation. It meant that if you made something somewhere else and you wanted to sell it up in this place that was going to be Minnesota one day, you went up the boats, the boats went up the river, and they ended in St. Paul. St. Paul was the center of navigation. Minneapolis, though, had the falls. So when they realized that they could harness that water power, they didn't need to be a place where goods came. They became a place where goods were made. And so that's the big difference between Minneapolis and St. Paul. There's also a thing that St. Paul actually started as a city first, but then there was a panic in 1857, which really gets lost to history, but which wiped out St. Paul. Minneapolis was too small at the time to really be affected by the panic. And that's what really allowed in the mid 1800s to the late 1800s. That's what really allowed that panic really crushed St. Paul. And like,
this is like an economic panic?
This is an economic panic. Yes, an economic
Not just
panic.
sort of like the panic.
I mean, and people might have been doing that. People might have been crazy, but St. Paul really took it in the gut. And so once they started to recover, Minneapolis was kind of already on the way. And so the race to be the bigger city, Minneapolis got a huge boost out of that, even though it still took them a few decades to take over St. Paul. That clipping, St. Paul got clipped at the knees there by that panic. That's what really allowed later Minneapolis to take over.
I had no idea. One piece I feel like I've heard, and maybe you can confirm, is it true that in that period, mid 19th century, St. Paul was sort of the loose and exciting town, and Minneapolis was more of the buttoned up side of the river?
Yes, and because St. Paul has a long its history of how it became St. Paul is it really, and this panic that I'm talking about really set the tone. After the panic, after St. Paul got clipped at the knees, they had to work together more to rebuild. And so you had these laborers, you had people who owned the businesses, you had the haves and the have-nots, but you really had to work a little more closely to like, we're in this together to rebuild St. Paul kind of a thing going on. I'm oversimplifying it a little bit, but just for the
no, it's good. Go, people, buy the book.
Buy the book. So St. Paul, they kind of had to band together, and yes, they had much more of a diverse culture that was part of that building of the city. In Minneapolis, which also there's a St. Anthony, which we know St. Anthony as the part across the river. That actually was its own city at one point, but they merged later. St. Anthony and Minneapolis were founded when they were founded as, these far outposts of colonization by the white people. They were founded by Puritans from New England. You literally had people coming here to say, we could make this place the temperate place. And so you had all these, I don't know what else to call them, goody two-shoes coming from New England who said, hey, yes, let's not drink, let's not do any of this, let's be good, upstanding citizens. And so, yes, that did happen. But it's very important to remember that Minneapolis absolutely lost that distinction in the late 1800s and became one of the most corrupt places in the country. And when you talk about the gangsters in St. Paul, which I'm sure you've heard about in the history, we had plenty of gangsters over here in Minneapolis too. They were two pretty rotten to the core cities at the beginning of the 20th century.
Why did that happen? Is it just because they were far enough away from other parts of the United States that, nobody was really watching?
Well, it was also just kind of a time of graft, right? The late 1800s you have Tammany Hall in New York, like this was a time of graft. And so there's no reason why it wouldn't happen here. What you did have in Minneapolis were the Washburns and the Pillsburys and all of these white men who were leading these industries. And because you had the river to ship the goods away and you were starting to get railroads, these men became the heads of national conglomerates. You weren't just building and making stuff for the good people of Minneapolis and maybe St. Paul. Like the flour that was made at the mill, at the falls, and the timber that was processed at the mills went everywhere in the country. So you had leaders of those companies who were really concerned about that. And if there was a little graft and corruption going on at City Hall, like I'm sad about that, but like my business is still gonna succeed and I'm more interested in my business. So Minneapolis in its founding had a lot more business-centric focus, which is actually a prelude to why we have the disparities and inequities that we do, especially in a place like Minneapolis. It was the few rich people running everything. And they didn't have to care that much about the people down at Bohemian Flats,
Right.
who were, it was an immigrant community at Bohemian Flats, which is just under the Washington Avenue Bridge, who literally plucked fruit out of the river that was discarded upstream to eat. That's how hard life was at Bohemian Flats.
And it flooded constantly.
Always flooded. It was always flooding. People would show up saying, I bought this plot of land here in Bohemian Flats from a guy, and they go to the plot and it doesn't exist. So they had to go into the river and get silt out of the bottom of the river. And there were rock chips, up the way a little bit. And they had to fill in the land that they had bought from a speculator who was just there to rip them off. So that's how Bohemian Flats got its way.
Okay, so there's a few things I want to unpack.
Yes.
Since you alluded to the disparities piece, let's tackle that first. As viewers of our show are probably well aware, Twin Cities, Minnesota generally, has some of the worst racial disparities in terms of education and wealth gap and things in the country. And you are just saying we can trace pieces of that back to this era. My only question to that is, wasn't a lot of the country sort of like that at that time? Was Minneapolis uniquely like set up with haves and have-nots?
No. Cities in the 1800s across the country began as little areas, right? Just little. New York City, New Amsterdam, whatever it was, started as Lower Manhattan, and it starts to slowly expand out, right? Same thing in Minneapolis happened here, and it starts to broaden out. The first mansions where the rich people lived were in downtown Minneapolis, because downtown Minneapolis was all of Minneapolis. Yeah. As they start to come out, you have Park Avenue, you have Lowry Hill, then they start moving south and southeast. There is absolutely a reason. So to answer your question, Tane, it is in many ways no different than what was happening in cities all over the country. But just so people know, the example here, there is absolutely a reason why there is a very Tony feel, a rich feel, when you go around the lakes, Lake of the Isles, Bedeh-Makaska, Lake Harriet. It's because the city built it that way. Yeah. The rich people wanted to go down there. Lake of the Isles was a horrible swamp that no one should have wanted to live on until it was dredged, until they came in and, sucked up all the water and unswamped it so that it became the lake it is today. And then suddenly the rich people were like, well, this would be a great place to live. And they were the ones who controlled the levers of power to let them live there. Then what you had in the 1910s was the introduction of racial covenants, which were part of deeds. When you sold a house, the deed that was signed over to the new owner started to have language that say, you, Tane, you're buying this house. You hereby promise to never sell it to a Black person or a Jew or a whole list of people who were not white and Presbyterian, frankly.
I didn't know the Presbyterian.
It wasn't who could buy it. It was a list of who couldn't buy it.
Right, yeah.
You promised to not sell it to any of these people. And so you actually had a neighborhood like Linden Hills in the early 1900s that had about I don't fewer than 20, but there were about a dozen black families in Linden Hills. But then when the racial covenants came in, by the 1950s, Linden Hills actually had zero black families. Like it actually like started, like there was a little bit of integration, and then the covenants come in and wipe it out. And if you want to know more about the covenants, Google Mapping Prejudice, which is a fantastic online project that has been researching all of these covenants in Hennepin County.
Yes. Yeah. Friend of the show, Kristen Delegard, started that project, Mapping Prejudice, and it is fascinating to see. And you can look up your own house in a lot of cases and see if it had one of these, or even potentially still technically does, although they are thankfully not legal anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting you bring that up. This is a side note, but I just moved into a house in South Minneapolis, which we did some research and found there was one of these African-American families in the early part of the 20th century who was living there in South Minneapolis. And it literally was, they were like one of about fewer than a dozen African-American families. And then this kind of stuff basically started happening. Like you can, through the Mapping Prejudice project, you can trace like how they were basically pushed out. And it's very sad, but an important part of our history. So this continues. We're kind of moving through history in some good ways. Is it fair to sort of, we talked some about in the industry of Minneapolis to sort of say it was like timber, flour, and I like now it's like middle management. That's what we're good at.
Well, you actually had offshoots. So what happened was Minneapolis also, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and frankly through World War II, and still to an extent today, is a national leader of artificial limb manufacturing, like prosthetics, because people who work in these mills before there were union protections would get things cut off their bodies in these machines all the time. And so you had these mills that started. You had a virulent anti-union campaign in Minneapolis, which was not happening in St. Paul. Everybody who worked in St. Paul was in a union. It doesn't mean they didn't have injuries, but Minneapolis had a virulent anti-union campaign headed up by the business interest. And so worker protection wasn't a thing. So what you ended up having were a lot of amputees themselves who started these businesses because they had a prosthetic leg or a prosthetic arm and they didn't like how it felt. So they wanted to get into the business to make these products better. So we actually had a lot of these companies in Minneapolis. So that's one example. The other example, which is much less serious, but because we're in Minnesota and it's cold and we want to be warm in the winter, underwear became a thing because when you made underwear in the 1800s and it was only made of wool to keep you warm, gosh, that's scratchy. But if you figured out a way to intersect wool with silk, then underwear becomes wearable. And then you had a company called Munsingwear, which was as well known for underwear as Kleenex is for tissue. You know how people today say, give me a Kleenex instead of giving me a tissue? Yeah. It used to be, I'm gonna go buy my Munsingwear. It was the word you would use instead of using the word underwear.
I didn't know that.
And when Munsingwear went out of business, they donated their collection of underwear to the Minnesota Historical Society. So the Minnesota Historical Society can claim the largest collection of underwear of any museum in the world. And if that doesn't make you proud to be a Minnesotan, I don't know what does.
Okay, so there's so many things to unpack here. I don't know where to begin. Well, let me ask you, okay, so we've gotten sort of to the first part of the 20th century, and I did try and promise people that we would go here. One thing, you mentioned a little about politics and corruption and graft. Like these days, we think of Minneapolis, Twin Cities generally, it's like a very progressive, strong
good government.
hold.
Yeah, good government. Yeah.
Yeah, good government. You know, people vote in extremely high numbers, that kind of thing. Is that a history that we can track back to why we love voting and we love clean government and that kind of stuff here?
So in 1900, we elected Doc Ames,
I love Doc
mayor.
Ames. Yeah.
Mayor. And he had already been mayor 3 other times. He was like Grover Cleveland, where he served non-consecutive terms, so he was the mayor for the 4th time. And the night he was sworn in on some early January 1900, that night he fires half of the police, because he wants to install people who basically are saloon owners and other political supporters to now be police. And the point was, we're no longer going to use the police for public safety. We're going to use the police to aid and abet our organized crime connections. So the police would actually help figure out, turn a blind eye here, be on the take there. So we were a horrible place. And there was this national article back then. When you had a national article written about you in a magazine like McClure's, it was a big deal. It was like, this is a big deal.
I'm going to just say, like, every time Minnesota ends up in the New York Times, I see it on every social media feed. So I don't know if that has changed.
Long before grape salad tore this country apart, you had an article in a magazine called McClure's called The Shame of Minneapolis, and it told about Doc Ames. And we had egg on our face. We were a horrible place. Like, the shame of Minneapolis in a magazine read all across the country. In the 1940s, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit, there was another national article that was called, it was called The Curious Twin, because it actually made a comparison between Minneapolis and St. Paul and said St. Paul was actually a little better here. But the point of that article was to declare that Minneapolis was the most anti-Semitic place in the country. We had a history of keeping blacks out. We had a history of anti-Semitism. From the top, the good government you're talking about really does start to come around in the 40s, when a young pharmacist turned political scientist named Hubert Humphrey becomes mayor of Minneapolis. And part of his coalition, which was a unique coalition to get elected, included business owners who were saying, we're sick of this. We're sick of being like this horrible place. I have also skipped past a Teamster strike in the 1930s that became internationally known. We had Trotskyites here in the city trying to start the revolution, the same kind of revolution that started with the Bolsheviks over in what became the Soviet Union. They said Minneapolis is the place to start the revolution, and they had a few early successes, but that largely didn't happen. But unionism and anti-unionism, like we were a mess. And Humphrey comes in and says, all right, let's start doing some things. And he had some victories, not as many as, like, we shouldn't, yes, there are statues for Humphrey, and I'm all for statues of Humphrey. And he got us down the road. He didn't turn the ship entirely, but he started us turning the ship towards what you were talking about with the good government example.
Okay, so I should say, in the second half of the show, we open it up for people who are watching at home to submit questions. So if they have questions, you can even start typing them now into the chats, whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook or any of these services, and we'll get them and ask Tom in the second half of the show. I guess let's, and I know we're skipping over tons of stuff. Again, go buy the book. Yeah, it's all in there. Where do you end in the book? Like, where do you land, I guess, towards the end of it? Because that seems like a hard part to do in a history of a city that is constantly changing and growing and being different.
I actually emailed my editor last week when the Supreme Court decision came out that affirmed that Bde-Makaska is the name of the lake that was once called Lake Calhoun, and asked her, is there any way to slip this in? Which is a horrible thing to ask the editor after the book has gone to the printer. So the answer is no, but I come right up to it. Like, I'm things that happened in 2019 are part of telling this story. During the edit process, I was able to make a very slight reference to pandemics, like the one we're living through now. And even though I don't tell the history of this book to include COVID because it bumps up too closely, the history you're reading about in this book helps explain why we're seeing the disparities that we're seeing even in the current pandemic. And there's a lot of talk about, people of color who are disproportionately affected by it. And so even though I don't mention that exact example in the book, the history of the book is going to be the thing that helps you understand why that is.
And so I'll just volunteer. When the book is out and we are in a place where you can do things like book signings, you can
Yes.
bring the book to Tom,
Yes.
and he will write in that last sentence about Dave McCosker that he really wanted to be in the book.
I will bring a copy of the ruling, and it's like 10 pages long, and you can use it as a bookmark.
That's perfect. All right.
Yeah.
Well, as I promised, we're going to bring Tom back in the second half of the show. But for right now, wherever you are, will you do a big round of applause? Mr. Tom Weber, everybody. Yay! All right. Now what happens? Tom and I are going to, oh, see, he already did. We're going to turn off our cameras. And we are going to turn the virtual stage over to the cast of the Theater of Public Policy. Everything they do is entirely made up. This is all improv comedy, which means that it is off the top of their heads. And in this case, just inspired by that incredible conversation we just had. So please, wherever you are, be generous, make a big round of applause, and enjoy this, a performance by the Theater of Public Policy.
Hey, Aaron. Do you mind helping me out? I'm writing up a grocery list. I'm just trying to make sure that there's nothing that I missed.
Totally.
Cool.
I'm happy to. What do you need? Well, I mean, like,
Cool.
what are you thinking?
I got Coke. I got Kleenex. I'm just gonna pick up a pack of Munsonware.
Yep.
Mine are all kind of just worn through.
Yep.
Jojo Bean's Magic Coffee Bean Juice. I was gonna grab one of those.
Good one. Good one. Yep.
Yeah. Senator Klingstein's butt paper. I'm gonna just grab some of that. And the last thing on my list is Senator Frank's tomato crush paste. Is there anything on that list that you need?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I think I would like some mung bean sprouts would be great if you have some space for it, or
what is that?
Sprouts?
What?
You know, mung bean sprouts.
It's hitting the air weird. Describe it for me. I don't know.
Well, they're sprouts, so they've sprouted. They're beans, so they're beanie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, you're talking about Cowboy Frank's ground nutrient pellets, right?
Welcome, James, to the citadel of the Minneapolis Library. What ancient tomb are you interested in checking out today?
Oh, I just want to know about what used to be the Metrodome, and maybe if I could learn something about somebody who may or may not be a vice presidential candidate. It's insane of me to think that those two things could merge, but possibly.
Yes, I think that we can service your needs here, but we have a sacrifice that you must overcome in order to obtain these tomes of ancient lore and prophecy.
Tell me of the sacrifice, because no sacrifice could be too great.
We here at the citadel of the Minneapolis Library require you to stop saying duck, duck, goose, and instead say duck, duck, gray duck.
That's madness! No, I shan't! No! What next? Hot dish?
Because I promise you, James, that if you get into those tomes and you forget, then we are going to make sure that all of your football teams lose from here until time eternal.
Oh, go on. Borrow me a tenner, why don't you?
Hello there, Chris. I am coming to you from the shores of the new Bade Makaska. We've been chatting with some of the runners and the walkers, and we're trying to get a beat on what the tone is now with the new title of the lake.
Wonderful. As we asked, if you wouldn't mind interviewing a couple and just letting us know how everyone's dealing with this important and incredibly pertinent change. Thank you, Aaron.
Exactly. So thank you. So I'm here with Mr. James Robinson, and again, I'd like to ask you, sir, about the change of the name to the native lake name Bade Makeska.
I'm an angry white man. It's Lake Calhoun. Bye.
Well, he seems a little angry about it. We're going to try and stay positive. I have another gentleman here, Mr. Washington. Sir, what do you think of the new official title of our native lake, Bade Makeska?
Well, I think it's pretty amazing. It's not a new name; it's an old name, but I'm really glad that we've finally chosen to embrace it.
What do you mean? What? I'm so sorry, sir. Please explain what the old name.
Yeah. So I mean, the reason we're changing it is we're changing it back to the name that it used to have before white people took it.
Before it was married, or?
Well, I mean, we really shouldn't have anything named after that Calhoun guy. He was a buzzard.
So this is actually their original name. The surname of the lake was really the Bade Makeska.
Well, I don't want to gender it.
Oh.
Chris, join me in a St. Paul panic.
Whoa, hey, whoa, Jim, what is going on here?
It seems like West 7th is closed again because of too much rain.
Well, don't get me wrong, that's inconvenient and probably worth getting kind of uproarious about, but does it necessitate a panic?
They're gonna turn 8 Mill Road into a greenway.
Cool. I'm a little bit worried that I don't want to say overreaction, but I'm going to say it, overreaction might cause an economic downturn. So I don't know, calm down a little bit.
You can't park at O'Gara's anymore because O'Gara's is gone.
Tim, I don't even know. Go over there. I don't know what it is.
We have 2 patinas.
So I would like to thank everyone for joining us on the tour of Mapping Prejudice today. The next location on our stop is, of course, the home of Aaron Roberts. Yes, this home has been standing here for a really long time. And hi, Aaron.
Hey. Welcome. Come on, please come on in.
Everyone, let's come up. Aaron, will you please explain the history of prejudice at this establishment?
Yeah, the history of prejudice at this I'm sorry, Doc. I thought this was like a modern living thing that you were gonna come in and talk about.
Yeah, we want
about the decoration.
All that you have obtained on the backs of other people.
Oh, question. I've heard that this house itself is just racist by proxy. Is that true?
Well, I don't know that it's exactly racist by proxy, but it's definitely had some nurture in its racism since its construction.
Doc, again, I bought these barn windows from a next door, and I repurposed them, painted them, upcycled, if you will, and I think it sort of ties the room together with sort of that sort of shabby chic seaside theme. Again, I thought this was kind of like
and you know that those neighbors that you got those windows from, they used to look through those windows to scoff at those less fortunate than they are.
I'm an angry white man and I miss Lake Calhoun and Block E.
Well, if it isn't old loosey-goosey Minneapolis over there.
Woo-hoo-hoo! Oh, that's loosey-goosey. Wait a minute, hold my drink. Oh,
now
God.
listen, over here in St. Paul land, where everything is very on the up and up, we're pretty embarrassed by your tomfoolery, Minneapolis.
I'm sorry, I'm not listening to you. I'm huffing some paint.
Whoa, classic Minneapolis while we're over here buttoning buttons even higher. My God, I can almost see a shirt. Oh, there we are.
We're taking our masks off.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. That's irresponsible, Minneapolis. Let's reel it in, shall we? Cool, I'm just gonna go do my own thing then.
Oh no, sad! The city's broke up. Oh, who would have seen that coming? Hey, that's thank you so much. That's the cast of the Theater of Public Policy. This is the part where I should say our business model has completely changed. See how I'm saying this with a smile? Because it's fine. It's great.
Everything's
but
fine.
we used to sell tickets for our shows, and we don't do that anymore. Now, all of the revenue that we make in order to pay our performers, because we pay our performers for everything they do and keep this theater running, comes from you donating. And so, if you enjoyed any part of that, if you're still watching, if you are looking forward to the second half of our conversation with Tom Weber, you can use one of the links below to make a donation if you're capable. If you're in a place to do that, that would be amazing, and it would mean a lot to us, and it would help us a lot. Typically, a ticket to a show is $12 to $15, so that is a great place to start. If you're really enjoying the show, or you want to celebrate that this is our last show, really give us like a kick out to the curb, chip in a little bit extra. That'd be great, and it'll help us keep these improvisers employed and fed and happy, and really rewarding them for the amazing things that they bring us every week. But that's enough out of me.
And if you donate, Tane, you can buy my book for about the same amount. So why buy one when you can buy two for twice the price?
Math.
It's an amazing deal.
It is. It's an amazing deal. All right. Oh, okay, so I'm going to just bring back our guest. I'm going to gallery mode it because this is the world we live in now. Hey, everybody, it's Tom Weber's back on the screen. We're so excited. We're chatting with him about the history of Minneapolis and his new book, Minneapolis, an Urban Biography. And this is the part of the show where we open up for you all to ask questions, and you can type them into the chat, and then they will come in and I will read them. And we did already get a couple of good questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first one that I'll just ask is, what's the deal with Nicollet Island?
Thank you for asking. So Nicollet Island was another very sacred place for the Dakota people. It's actually the place where Dakota women went to give birth. There was something sacred about the island where they went there just above the falls to give birth. It also had trees that gave maple trees where they would do sugaring in the spring as well. So Nicollet Island was a very, very important island to the Dakota people as a sacred place. Then when it started to become what became the city of Minneapolis and the city of St. Anthony, it has a crazy history. So there were these two crazy guys who bought Nicollet Island. This was back when you could buy Nicollet Island. So we have milling going on. We have these mills on the river, and they're churning out timber and they're churning out grain. And Washburn, over on the west bank of the river, which, that's the side that became General Mills, and Pillsbury is on the east side, which became Pillsbury. So then these two guys are like, I got to get on the milling business. They bought the island and initially tried to sell it right back for a profit to the city to make into a park. And that idea went to a public referendum. It lost. And as a total side note, the only reason it lost is because back then, the referenda that were put to voters could be about two different things, and you had to just vote once. So it was actually a referendum that said, should we merge Minneapolis and St. Anthony into one city, which was controversial back then, and while we're at it, should we buy this land to make it a park? And there was no way to vote separately on those issues. You just had to vote yes or no, and both of them got a yes or no vote. So it didn't pass. Long story short, these jokers who bought the island then tried to build a mill on their island, but they had this crazy, there was a lawsuit and blah, blah, blah. They were digging under the river to build the mill. And I lay it out in the book, and that it's very complicated to try to picture it, but they're building a mill and they're trying to build under the river this channel that after the water comes in and powers your mill, the water's got to get spit out somewhere, and they would send them down these channels. So while they're digging this channel, it collapses. Now, it's hard to comprehend this, but they were actually digging this channel under the river. The riverbed is here, and they're digging under here. It's kind of how, like, you know, it's how a subway in New York goes under the Hudson River. They're digging under the riverbed. But when this collapsed, the riverbed above it also collapsed. And so what you actually had, and this is in 1870, I'm losing my days, 1872, St. Anthony Falls actually collapsed in this area, and the force of nature was so torrential that part of Nicollet Island was actually thrown away. Like Nicollet Island became smaller in that crisis because it got eaten away and spit out this channel downriver. We almost lost the falls that day.
Right.
We literally, and it's so hard to comprehend, but we almost lost the falls. And if you don't have a falls, why do you need a city? Because none of these mills need to be here anymore if you don't have this water power coming through. So then so that was a huge part of Minneapolis's history. Later in the 1910s, there was this grand idea, let's make Nicollet Island home to a stadium and an airport. I'm guessing airports were a little smaller back then. I'm guessing stadiums were a little smaller back then. But Nicollet Island has this really long history of kind of being in the middle of it all. And there it is today. And a lot of people who live on Nicollet Island today have chickens and raise eggs. I just wanted to, that's not in the book. It's just something I know.
Yeah, it's this fascinating, and it's exciting that it's so much in the book. It's this weird place that it's park board land largely that people lease, which sort of preserves that you can have chickens there. Okay, we're getting lots of questions. People have all kinds of things they want to know. This question came in twice, and I hesitate to ask you this. Well, I'm going to just ask you. And
do it. Go for it.
Why is Uptown south of downtown?
There actually is an answer, and I'm going to point you, Google this. The Star Tribune has a series called Curious Minnesota. And did Eric write that one?
He's a very handsome reporter.
Yeah, okay. Did Eric write it? So there's actually an article that you should Google right now that answers this question. Google Star Tribune, Eric Roper, Uptown, how did it get its name? Honest to God, he does a much better job, and this will allow us to get to more questions. So talk to Tane's fiance.
Yes.
Fiance, or are you married yet?
Yeah, no, fiance.
Oh, fiance and
well, you got married right now, but the rest of us are all kind of dating.
So look that up. It's a great story.
Okay. Yeah, it is a good story, and the short answer is branding, basically. Yeah. Okay. This is a question from Rob. Was there any pushback when Minneapolis city planners decided to have a park every few blocks? We do have a lot of parks. Was that controversial at any point?
Well, so the park system, and there is actually a history of the park system in Minneapolis that was written in the last decade that you should get as well. Just look it up. It's literally the history of the Minneapolis parks or something like that. So initially, when Minneapolis was so small, right, it was basically just downtown. Go back to remember how thick the woods were around in Minnesota before Minnesota was Minnesota. There was no need for parks because people said, why would we have a park in Minneapolis when we can just leave the city limits in 10 minutes and we're in the woods? So there's actually a lot of pushback around the idea of building parks in the early days of Minneapolis. But then the state created the Minneapolis Park Board. It actually happened on the same exact day and I don't know if it was the same piece of legislation, but it happened the same day. It might have been. It was the same day in which the state, and remember, this is back when if you wanted to expand your boundaries, you actually needed the state to pass a law to expand your boundaries. The state also made Minneapolis larger. So the same day that Lake of the Isles, Bedamikoska, Lake Harriet, and I think Nokomis and Diamond Lake and not Diamond Lake, but Lake Hiawatha, the day that those lakes became inside the city limits was the same day the park board was created. And so you had this park board that said, what are we going to do with parks? And this grand plan to build parkways and to make the areas around lakes, you know, what are now today like trails and things like that, that began in the 1800s. When you talk about biking the Grand Round scenic, you see the maps all there, that actually is not that different from the original master plan for the parks back in the 1800s. And so there was some pushback because there were people who owned the land next to lakes, but they ended up donating it, or the city would buy it from them, you know. But for the most part, these lakes, which were now being inhabited by rich white people, they didn't hate the idea of having this parkland near them as well. The biggest thing about Minneapolis is that when you think about Minnesota, you think about all the people who own cabins, who own houses somewhere else in Minnesota on the lake. Their property actually touches the lake. You can walk down from the house and jump in the lake. People in Minnesota live on the lakes. People in Minneapolis live near the lakes. There are only about 12 properties in Minneapolis that actually touch a lake. Every other part of every lake in Minneapolis, and we have a lot of lakes in Minneapolis, is publicly owned. It's parkland, cool. Yeah. Which has to go back to the 1800s with this master plan.
That is a very unique and cool thing, especially for folks who've been to other cities or other places where, you know, right around the lake just all gets developed and turned into private land. It is something special and unique about here. Right. Okay, this is one that I have wondered about. Ashley submitted the question. So European settlers coming in, and as we just very briefly alluded to, it was French fur traders were some of the first ones, and there are little pieces of French like still left in like our state motto, La Tour du Nord, and a few other things, but we're overwhelmingly like identified as a state these days as Scandinavian German. So the question is, does Tom have any opinions about Minneapolis originally being a city with some French founding and now is primarily associated with Nordic German heritage?
So the French had a presence in what is now Minnesota, and this is hard to comprehend because there's so little in the history books about this, but the French were here for a good 2 centuries, 200 years before the British came in. And there was the French and the British fought, and there were treaties and blah, 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 and then the British came in. But the French, let's think about it, the French were here for 200 years. But, and this again goes back to this book, North Country, which tells a really good history about this. The French weren't here to dominate the land. They had a very small footprint here. They didn't have a ton of people here. And they knew from day one that they actually had to really have a really good working relationship with the indigenous people who were here and across all of New France, which is now Canada, and down into what is now Minnesota. So there was a working relationship because native people got supplies they need. The French got these furs that were so popular back in Europe, the beaver pelts and all of that. And trust me, the French still messed this up. They still messed it up in a way that the indigenous people no longer trusted them. They broke promises and things like that. But it's really hard to comprehend that the French were here that long. There was a lot, though, of intermarriage. And part of the Dakota culture, and I acknowledge that I'm a white man trying to explain Dakota culture, so I'm not going to get it right, and I'm doing it with the utmost respect that I have for it. But there's a lot of Dakota culture in that time that says when you marry into the family, you are the family. And so if the Frenchman comes along and marries into the Dakota family, there's actually something that both of them can get out of that on the more money side of things. And I'm not giving that relationship justice. I would actually encourage you to read North Country and other books like Fort Snelling at Bidote. That's a good one. And Minnesota Makoche, The Land of the Dakota. This is a really good book from the Historical Society. So anyway, what am I talking about? A lot of the French people who were here, a lot of them went off and founded St. Paul, to be honest with you. It's interesting that you say that the French names aren't here a lot, except for the motto. We actually have, you have to remember this, there are a ton of Dakota names in our place names, like say, Minnesota. Minnesota is a Dakota name. And so when we go back to the Bede-Makaska example, and I write about this in the book, when that was happening, when the name was being changed, you might remember that there was a very rich man who lived on the lake who didn't like this idea and was part of the group that sued to go back to Lake Calhoun. And he wrote a newspaper commentary. That's my cat meowing, by the way, if you can hear it in the background. He wrote a newspaper commentary in which he said this line. This is in the newspaper commentary that this guy wrote. What exactly have the Dakota Indians done that is a positive contribution to all Minnesotans?
Oh, God.
Yogi, my cat, is abhorred by that because the guy used a Dakota name in the sentence asking what the Dakota Indians have done that is a positive contribution. Minnesota is a Dakota name. So anyway,
Yeah.
I don't remember what the question was, but I'm going to stop talking now. And the Scandinavians.
How did the Scandinavians end up here?
This is a time, the Homestead Act was a big part of this. You have to think national and international. Immigration history is important. So remember when I mentioned how Minnesota was so thick with woods, it was kind of a delayed start, right? Because it was later that people got here. Because of that, when Minneapolis and Minnesota were being founded, it was a little later in the 1800s. And that was at a time when a lot of the immigration that was coming to the United States was from Scandinavia. So it was really a product of that. If Minnesota or Minneapolis had been founded a few decades later, you would have had more Italians. You would have had more Jewish people and Eastern Europeans, Jewish people from Eastern European coming. It just fit with the times that at the moment Minneapolis was growing and Minnesota was growing, that was the wave of immigrants who were coming to the country.
Okay, we're going to do a bit of a lightning round with a few questions here. One is just, this is something we alluded to. There aren't a ton of histories of Minneapolis. Like you've held up several books, but they're mostly histories of the state or of the region or things like that. Why? Why do you think there aren't more histories of the city in particular?
You know, I don't know. But if you buy my book, I don't know. I don't know how I'm going to finish that sentence. Anyway, no, I think that what happens is there are a lot of histories of Minnesota, and you can't tell a history of Minnesota without Minneapolis. So it's not like the story isn't being told somewhere. But if you really look at Minneapolis, and I actually mentioned this in the prologue, if I were going to tell the history of just Minneapolis as it exists today within the current boundaries, right? The current boundaries of Minneapolis, if I were only going to tell that story of that glob of land, then I couldn't talk about Fort Snelling and I couldn't talk about Bidote. They're not technically inside the city limits.
Right.
And so it's part of it is there is a challenge. If you want to say, I want to write a Minneapolis history, you actually can't. You have to include histories of places either just outside Minneapolis or as the state comes together. So I actually get it. There's part of me that gets why that's happening because Minneapolis has played such an important part in shaping the rest of Minnesota. And there might be people who don't like that fact. And there's this urban rural thing going on that really upsets me that they don't get along, because the truth is that we were so dependent on each other for so many generations. If you're a farmer in southern Minnesota or western Minnesota, you're probably growing wheat. Well, where are you going to send that wheat to be processed into things like flour? Minneapolis. If you're a lumberjack in the North Woods and you're cutting down trees right and left, where are you going to send those logs to be processed? Minneapolis. Everything used to funnel through Minneapolis, and that was the yin and the yang of how urban and rural had depended on each other, and we've lost some of that. And I'm not answering your question anymore, but that's the tangent I decided to go off on.
Yeah. This is somebody wants to know, Connie wants to know if you're going to record an audio book version of this book.
We got a little messed up with COVID. I actually suggested that, hey, if you need an audiobook, like I have a little bit of experience with that. I don't know the answer to that right now, but I do suspect people from the Minnesota Historical Society Press are watching this. So maybe I'll get an email about that tomorrow, because I would love to do it.
Connie's ready to buy it if you,
the
Minnesota
audio version?
Historical Society. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it's been recorded yet. I don't know where that is. I would love to do it, but that all got kind of just, with COVID, we all just kind of had to focus on other things.
You're telling me. Okay, one last question, which I think is a great question to end on, that comes from a friend of the show, Julie Blaha, wants to know, is there something that you had to leave out of the book that just sort of breaks your heart that ended up on the cutting room floor?
Other than the history of the theater of public policy.
Right. Well,
it's nowhere to be found in the book, and I'm sorry about that.
Well, this interview is over.
I'm glad I saved that for the end. You know, it was really about telling the story of. So the answer is yes. I can't think of what it is right now that I left on the floor.
I mean, maybe I would ask it this way: was there anything, maybe not just like a particular anecdote that got left on the cutting room floor, but is there a piece that was just like, there's not a good way to get this part of this story in here?
Yes, but I don't know what, because I'm trying to think through the 17 edits I did on this book to see what came out. I really think I was able to put a lot of what I wanted into the book for this reason. The through line is telling stories that help explain why we have the inequities that we do. That's the point of this book. Yes, it's a history of Minneapolis, but the point of the book is to tell that history in a way that helps explain that the inequities we're facing today are not at all new, and that there's a history as to why they came here. And so I think that actually I was able to do a lot of that and get a lot of that out.
Okay, I know I said that was the last question, but then let me ask you one more. It's our season finale. What are people going to do? Cancel us? If that's the through line of the book, and you make that case throughout, so we're here now. Let's say someone reads your book and they say, "Yep, I totally see. He makes this case that's how we got to where we are now." Now what? Is that something that you try and look at in your book? Is knowing that that's how we got here enough, or is there some other piece?
Well, a wise man once said that knowing is half the battle, Tane. I don't know if you're old enough to know that reference, but I'll leave that for anyone who's my age or older. No, I don't say now what. I say this is it. Winston Churchill once said that the future is unknowable, but the past should give us hope. And hopefully that if we can say, this is from whence we came, and there's some real black eyes in our history. You know, we get on these lists of best parks and our airport is great and we're the best place to live. We're on all these lists, but we're also on these lists that come out the same time the lists come out that say the inequities are this bad and the disparities are that bad. And both things are true. I love living here. I love it here. And I get we're a great secret. And gosh, if more people lived here, that would be great too. Both things can be true. I don't try to solve the problem, frankly, because no one has yet. But in the time I was a reporter, I saw a lot of people admiring the problem in a way that suggested to me they didn't know the history. And I think that we can maybe move the needle a little bit if we at least know the history. There is a Plymouth Avenue on the north side, could be its own book, and in many ways is its own book if you look at a couple other books that are out there. If you don't know the history of Plymouth Avenue, if you don't know the history of the race riots in Prospect Park and Linden Hills to try to kick Black people out of those neighborhoods, if you don't know the history of I-94 being built, I-35W being built, the Gateway being knocked down in the name of urban renewal, if you don't know those histories, then when you walk down Washington Avenue, you're the gestalt is different and your awareness is different. And I just think that people should be armed with that knowledge a little bit more, especially if they're going to start sitting on commissions and panels and this thing and that thing to try to help solve the problem.
On that note, can we all do a really big round of applause? Mr. Tom Weber, thank you so much for joining us for this. This was absolutely delightful. I'm so excited. One more time, the book, Minneapolis, an Urban Biography, and people can pre-order it now.
Yes.
Go and Google, and we'll link to how you can pre-order it. But we got to turn it over to the cast one more time because you dropped so many truth bombs on us here. We got to bring all of that into improv world. So one more time, I'm not going to say anything else. I'm going to just turn it over to the cast of the Theater of Public Policy. Again, all made up, all on the spot. So one more time, a round of applause for the Theater of Public Policy.
St. Anthony, it's so good to see you. Please sit down, have a biscuit.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me. I do love a good biscuit.
Yeah, St. Anthony, the reason I asked you to come over today is Minneapolis, me and St. Paul were having a conversation, and well, we think that this area needs a nickname with some pizzazz to it, and
Okay.
we were throwing some things around, and we thought that the Twin Cities sounded really great.
Twin Cities.
Yeah,
Okay.
there are 3 cities here, so
Okay, well, okay. So already I see a small problem. Twins imply. So you're saying you'd be fraternal twin because you don't really look alike at all. Let's be
no,
honest.
I mean, we don't look exactly alike, but twins just implying double, and triplet cities just doesn't have a ring. It doesn't flow off the tongue in the same way.
So also, where is the are you talking about Nicollet Island? Because that's not a city. Like, where would be the third city?
Anthony, you, I'm afraid, cannot be a city anymore. So I'm going to eat you. And
Right. You got to eat me. Okay, that's well, that's a hard pill to swallow, but I definitely see where you're coming from.
But then you would still be a part of the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul.
That don't look alike, though.
That's all right. I mean, there are lots of twins that don't.
Oh, hey, Urban.
Oh, hey there, rural.
Look,
How
I
you
want to say
doing?
that I haven't been very nice lately, and now that the Guthrie is going to cancel the Christmas Carol, I underestimated you, and I just want to say I'm sorry. I always liked coming in and seeing that, and I also liked going to those restaurants. I thought Sawat D was really tasty. It was spicy but tasty, and so I underestimated you, and I am sorry.
Hey, rural, I understand. I'm not exactly sin-free here myself, now am I?
Well, to
All the
say
people
least.
around here just keep thinking of you guys as, there's only so few of you, so what does it matter? But we depend on you too for like milk, and there's a bunch of other stuff that I'm not really good at this. I'm sorry.
Swedish and Danish people from the suburbs.
Oh,
See, that's the problem.
well, what do you mean? What's going on?
No, it's just that I think that we've simplified it, and we don't understand that, where we've come from. I mean, as a rural person, I want to say that I'm here just really because of time and geography, and I appreciate having my Swedish and Danish suburbanites, and I want to say that I underestimated you as well. I think I've underestimated everybody in this whole state.
Again, it's not just you, Rural. We've all made a bunch of mistakes, haven't we?
We have. But maybe we could change it. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you that we're more than just corn mazes. And if you could all just say that something about yourselves that you're more than, that'd be great.
We're more than a delightful night out with wine and theater.
Oh, I love that. How about you, Suburb?
Well, we're more than just cute blonde people.
Well, that's a start.
Yeah.
Why, hey there, young Minneapolis resident. I understand that you want to go to Lake Hiawatha.
Well, that was the plan there. I'm sorry, I don't know.
I apologize. My name is the Minneapolis Wood, and I am thick.
Oh, that's great. You're not gonna make this difficult, are you? I mean, I was really excited about seeing the thing.
Yeah, well, you know, on your way to Lake Hiawatha, I will stand in your way. I will make the terrain very difficult. Because I'm a jerk.
Okay, that could you not? Is there a way to just not do that?
Well, I suppose that if you were to do something for me, I could make getting to this lake a little bit easier for you.
Oh, I could like rip you out of the ground and create industry around here. Is that cool? Or
that sounds very traumatizing to me.
Yeah, it probably wouldn't be great, huh?
No.
I don't have a better idea. I got actually pretty excited about that one.
What if I let you tear up a lot of my brothers and sisters, but in the areas around the lakes, you let us be?
That's kind of nice around there. What if we don't do that and we change it and we all live around it a little bit?
I think I could deal with that.
It's really forgiving of you, Woods. I appreciate that.
You're welcome, resident.
Well, I've been hiking for a really long time. All I want to do is take a dip in that lake.
Well, it ain't gonna happen because I'm a St. Paul gangster. And I come over to Minneapolis to try to enforce some law. If you think you're going to touch that lake, only 12 of us touch the lakes here.
What?
I'm one of them coming over here. I'm a gangster.
Okay, but I'm 5 and all I want to do is go to the beach.
We all want to go to the beach. But if you're a gangster, you know that you got to do something special to get to the beach.
Okay, well, first of all, I'm not supposed to talk to a stranger, especially weird fedora strangers. What am I supposed to do?
Well, you could perhaps start a granary on the river, and then when the island starts to fall apart, you capitalize on the catastrophe, and then you start a speakeasy when... What am I saying? You're 5 years old.
Mister, you're using big words. I don't even know what capitalize means.
Can I take off my fedora and speak from the heart?
Please do, sir. You look first of all, now you look like my uncle, so I definitely can talk to you now.
Well, that's not good reasoning, but I'm going to go on anyway. Look, just be a good girl. Remember that people in St. Paul and Blaine and Mankato and way up north, they're all good people, but we got to recognize what we did to get here. And a lot of it ain't pretty. Now, you're pretty, but you got to be pretty in the heart, too. I'm getting sappy, so I'm going to put my fedora back on and maybe go find some cigars and some hooch. But
hooch?
Never mind.
Look it up. Did somebody say hooch?
Hey, how you doing there? Good to see ya. Yeah. Adios.
Hey, Jim. Oh, hey. How's it going, Duck?
Hi. things are going really well. I just learned so much about the history of all the horrible things that have happened here.
Oh, that's great. There's probably like a bunch of good stuff that.
It is great because now I know, and knowing is half the battle. Now that I know my past, I can move forward into the future in a better way.
Well, it's a beautiful sentiment, Duck. I'm really excited for you. I'm glad that you really were able to delve into the horrible. No, I'm really glad that you were able to move forward and really learn a lot.
No, I mean, I couldn't believe that I didn't know the things that I didn't know. You know, but now that the world is changing in my mind, I feel like maybe I can push us to be better so that maybe we don't have all the inequalities that we've had. Maybe I can't, but now I can at least try.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm the ghost of Hubert Humphrey, and I've been listening. Yes. Yeah, I have. And I want to say that what you just said makes me proud. I'm the happy warrior. I show that you can live in a dichotomous situation, recognizing contradiction and finding the dynamic tension within, and then embracing it, not being simple-minded or single-minded or simply binary. These are big words. I tried to teach them to a little girl that I met in the guise of a mobster. But I just want to say...
Hubert Humphrey, were you pretending to be a gangster again?
I did anything it took to get through to people. And yeah...
It's my uncle again! Hey, Uncle Joe!
Oh, you just exposed me.
Well,
go home, Molly. Go home.
Hubert, I want to thank you for everything that you've done for us. Except I have to ask why you didn't do more to sustain a good basketball team here in the Twin Cities.
Well, Los Angeles made a good offer, and I thought, I can't do everything.
That might be the best ending to a show I can remember in a long time. Oh, the ghost of Hubert Humphrey giving up our basketball team. Hey, everybody. Thank you all so much for being with us, for watching the show tonight. This has absolutely been fantastic. This has been our virtual season. As I alluded to at the top of the show, we are going to keep doing things this summer. We have a workshop next week that we would love for you to take from. And I will say this, we would love to hear from you watching at home what you'd like us to do in this weird virtual world. We're not going to be doing live shows with a packed theater. We could do more virtual shows like this. We can do more workshops. We could do more virtual tours of museums for dogs, or we could do something entirely new and different. You tell us what you would like us to do that brings you thinky, fun entertainment. I got to say a few thank yous for helping make this amazing season possible. Thank you so much to Finnegans Beer. Don't forget, you can go tomorrow to Finnegans, mention the Theater of Public Policy. You get 10% off. All of the beer that you drink will be helping feed the hungry. So that's amazing. Oh my gosh, look at it. There is, why am I talking still? Nobody cares about me. Okay. I'm putting everybody else back up on the screen. These are the amazing people who made tonight happen, including our amazing guest, Tom Weber. And what cat is that?
This is Yogi.
Hi, Yogi. And then with you, your fabulous wife, our Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan, everybody. Hey, this is great. Oh, this is fun. All right. Well, stick around. We have another hour and a half show we're going to do with the Peggy Flanagan. That's the end. That's the end of our season. Thank you to Finnegans. Thank you to the Bryant Lake Bowl, who's amazing. And get some brunch from them this weekend because we want them to be around for a long time to come. Let's do one more big thanks to our amazing cast tonight, who has been
Duck Washington,
Jim Robinson,
Chris Rodriguez,
Aaron Roberts,
Dennis Curley. Hello.
It is Curly. And now, one more time, our guest, Mr. Tom Weber, everybody. Please go buy his book, Minneapolis, an Urban Biography. You can pre-order it now. As soon as it is out in stores, go and buy it from your local bookseller, and you will be the smartest person at your next Zoom cocktail party. It is absolutely a delight. Thank you all so much for watching. We love you. We miss you. And we hope to see you all very soon again. Until then, I'm going to throw it back to Dennis Curley.
I remember when we were young. T2P2 was so much fun. Holding hands at the Bryant Lake Bowl. Didn't worry about viruses or damage control. Now the biggest thing that we have learned is that social contact must be earned. Gotta keep our actors far apart. Turns out Zoom and YouTube are now state of the art. Well, distance improv and distance learning mean your brain just can't keep still. You never knew you were better time, and I guess you never will. Well, now it's Monday, it's after 5, and when we're quarantined, we'll thrive. D2P2 is a going alive. Live, la 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 live, la 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 live, la 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 live. I wish Yogi had his own YouTube channel, but until then, you gotta stick with the T2P2 YouTube channel. Find us on all the social media. Thanks everybody for watching. It's been a super fun season. We'll see you next time.